In the previous videos, we have examined how to create, connect to, and manipulate databases using JDBC. Now we will create a GUI database. Step 1. Creating a JFrame GUI version of our database. We're continuing to utilize JDBC databases and SQL. And now we're going to look at just creating a very simple graphical interface. So in this next project, I have imported the Java SQL package, which I need for connection objects and statements and executing SQL commands and things, result sets, all those things that we need. I'm importing the swing package, which I'll need for JFrame components, JButtons, JText fields, JLabels, JFrames. The Abstract Windows Toolkit and the Abstract Windows Toolkit event packages, in this case for Action Listener, so that I can implement the Action Listener interface for button clicks. So these are the imports, and then I simply created a class, called it Data6, and it's implementing Action Listener. And remember, whenever you implement Action Listener, you have to include the required action performed that come down here. Otherwise, it would be a syntax error. It's abstract. Has to take an action event as an argument. So we'll cover that in a little bit. I'm going to try to just go through this code step by step. And I figured it would be quicker if I just went through and kind of highlighted things than typing it out. So I'll do this to try to make the video quicker and more brief, and yet I'll still try to make sure that I cover every part of each stage of this application we're going to build. Okay, so we've got our imports, we've got our empty class, we decided to implement Action Listener, and you would have come down here and you would have just simply typed in an empty action performed. Okay, there would be no code there, but you couldn't compile and test your syntax if you didn't at least have that empty function, because remember, when you implement an interface, you also have to implement any of its methods, its functions, in this case action performed. Once I did that, in my global section, I just need a few things. For my database, basically, we need a connection object, we'll call it connects. We need a statement object, we'll call it state, and we need a result set object, we'll call it result. And I'm just going to use these over and over and pass them back and forth between functions. So I decided to make them global. Alternatively, you could have declared them locally in a method and simply done that in each function. But right now they're globals. Now, in addition to my database globals, I have some GUI globals for my graphical user interface, and I'm going to need to create a JFrame. So I have a JFrame called main window. I have JLabels, JText fields, and JButtons. And in this example, I'm just going to have 4 navigation buttons, next and previous, to go through different records in the record set, and then first and last. Okay, so those are all my globals. Well, what happens first? In any program or application, main is what happens first. This is a JFrame app, not a JApplet, so there's no init method. But in my main function, I'm going to use the new keyword and build an instance of the Data6 class. And when I do that, it's going to call its constructor. And so if you look at the constructor of the class, the very first thing that happens is we call the connect method. All right, and then these other functions, I'll go through them one by one, but let's go down to the connect method and see what happens. We only have to do this one time, and that's when we build the JFrame, call the constructor, it's going to go call connect. Well, I tried to modularize everything or break everything into separate functions step by step. So here you can see in the connect method, we're simply using the for_name function here to reflectively or dynamically load the JDBC ODBC bridge driver. And we have, in this case, a direct path to the directory and the name of our database file here. And then here's the Microsoft Access driver. And we're concatenating these two strings together into database. And we're going to pass it in as an argument or parameter to the getConnection method on the driver manager object. And then we're going to assign the return result of that or value to connects, our global connection object up here. Remember, we had our globals. All right, so of course that needs to be in try and catch blocks. Most of these operations that have to do with JDBC need to be enclosed in try and catch blocks, so you'll get used to seeing that. But that's all that function does. From this curly brace to this curly brace, it takes care of creating and setting up the connection and connecting to the database file. And in this case, it is a DSN-less connection or a direct connection to the database. It didn't have to go use any data source name tool and create a DSN. It's just a direct. Step 2. Let's code the events for the next, previous, first, and last buttons. To do this, we use the following result set methods. Next, which advances to the next record, previous, which moves backwards to the previous record, first, which moves to the first record, and last, which moves to the last record. Now, that brings us to our next method. Once we set up the connection, we're going to go call the function selectData. And that's going to basically just establish our first record set and give us our first result set. So I'm going to go down to selectData, and again, as I said before, most of these operations will be in try and catch blocks. And we're going to simply take our statement object, our global statement, we're going to call create statement, and I need to pass in type, scroll, and sensitive in this case so that I can, if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have access to the previous method. And since I'm adding frontwards and backwards buttons or next and previous buttons, I need to specify type, scroll, and sensitive. And for the result set right now, in this example, it's just read only. But in future examples, we'll also open it with in a writable context so that we can update things to the database. Okay, so selectData is doing what it does here. Then once I create my statement object and assign it to my global statement, I'm going to set up a SQL string. Okay, select in this case everything from inventory. That's my SQL. There's the wildcard. Then I'm just going to pass in that SQL string as an argument or parameter to execute query. And I'm going to assign the results of that to my global result set object. Okay, that's the second thing that we do. Well, after we do this, now we need to actually build the graphical user interface. So how do we do that? Well, in this function, I'm going to instantiate a new JFrame called main window. I'm going to set the size 700 wide by 200 tall. And I'm going to set the default close operation, exit on close. Once I have built my instance of JFrame, I'm ready to start adding components. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take my components here, and I'm going to instantiate or build new JLabels and new text fields. When I do that, I'm going to build a new JPanel right here. Then I'm going to add all my components to my JPanel object, BG, background. I'm going to add action listener to my JButtons so that way action listener can listen for and handle button clicks in the action perform method. And finally, I'm going to turn around and add my panel to my JFrame. And the last thing I want to do after I've done everything and set everything up is call the set visible method. And that'll cause my JFrame to display or show. Okay. So that's after I set up my GUI. And then finally, after that's done, I've made the connection and I've acquired a result set and set up and executed a SQL query against the database, and I've built the graphical user interface. Then I'm just going to go call this method here, display data, from the constructor. And let's see what that does. If I call display data, again, it's in try and catch blocks. And I'm simply going to take my result set and call the next method or function on it, which will advance it, in this case, to the first record. Okay, so it's just been loaded. That'll go to the first record in the result set. I call it next. And then when I do that, I simply want to get the field values from my database. So I'm going to call getString on ID, name, quantity, and price. And those are the fields in the database. And I'm going to use the setText method. I'm just doing a little bit of nesting here. Such that the text on those text fields will be set from the values in my database fields. And here's my database. I'll open it up. I'm going to go over here. Here's the access inventory table. And if you look, I have 4 fields: ID, name, quantity, and price. And you can see my records there. I have 12 records. Well, I just have to make sure that I match those field names exactly. And notice I've done that here: ID, name, quantity, and price. Okay? So that'll happen, and then at that point, nothing else will happen when we load the program. So let's run it and just see what it looks like real quick. We'll build it, and I'm going to go ahead and right-click and run. And notice it pops up, and there's the first record. All right, 1, power supply, PC, quantity 100, price 75. Now, I haven't gone over the code for the buttons yet, so I'll do that next, but I just wanted you to see what it looks like when these 4 methods or these 4 functions are called from the constructor, and I want you to know what they do, step by step, line by line. Okay, so after doing all of that, that kind of takes care of the preliminary things that we need to do or take care of. Now the rest of the action of our program goes into the action performed function or method. Let me collapse this box here so you can see more code. Okay, so in our action perform method, there's a million ways to do this. You can build you you can instantiate an action listener object and then throw nest inside of an action performed object on the fly. And we've done that before in several examples. And you can put everything in action performed. We've done that in several examples. Again, I like to try to show you, 3, 4, 5 different ways of doing the same thing, so that you know that you have alternatives and you can, find the one that you think works the best for you. So here's just another way of coding action performed, and the inspiration for this is it's sort of the way I code MFC projects. With the MFC message map, you have an AFX underscore message handler function. So I put all of these inside one single action perform method. I'm kind of using this as like a message map. Here's an action event every time any of those buttons gets clicked. It calls the function getSource and assigns the value to this object here, source. And then I can simply use these if statements here. And then if source was be next, be previous, be first, be last, any of those buttons, I'm going to go call the appropriate event handler method or function. Now, alternatively, instead of putting this in separate functions, I could have just put all the code inside these curly braces. So I would have had a lot of nested curly braces all inside this function. But I thought that it would be easier to follow and kind of easier to keep track of if instead of doing that, I broke it up into smaller chunks, smaller pieces, or smaller functions, and just called them one by one. That way you can see where one function begins and then another function ends, and as far as how the actions are handled. So let's take a look at how these buttons work in action performed. So if the be next button is clicked, in other words, source happens to be be next, we're going to call the be next action. So what happens there? Again, all of these operations need to be in try and catch blocks when you're dealing with database objects of JDBC and SQL. Well, I'm simply going to go call the next method on my result set. Remember, result is an instance of my result set. Okay, and if I can do that, that is, if I haven't reached the end of the database, then I'm just going to display the field values of those next items. So remember, we started out when we ran select data, right? We started out here, and then we basically selected our first record and we displayed it. We called that from our constructor. Well, when I click the next button, every time I do that, it's going to advance to the next record and the next record and the next record. And then when it does, I'm going to take my text fields. In this case, with set text, I'm doing a little bit of nesting, and I'm going to call the methods getString, again matching all of the field values. Now, when I can no longer advance, when next can no longer go, therefore it's reached the end of the database, the last row in the database, then instead of this if part here occurring, the else part is going to occur. And what am I going to do? Well, in order to keep it from, if I didn't do result previous, you'd have to click like the previous button twice to go backwards. So I'm going to reset the pointer to just above the last row there. And that way it'll kind of sync up previous to next, or previous and next if I click on it. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm just going to fire off a JOption pane saying, hey, you reached the last record. Just to kind of warn the user, let the user know why they can't go any further by clicking next. Okay? So that's what happens when they click the next button. Now when they click the previous button, what happens? Well, pretty much the same thing. Matter of fact, I just copied and pasted all that code there. And the only thing I changed was, instead of calling next like I did up here, I call previous to move backwards. Everything else is the same. And now, same thing, when I get to the beginning, I want to move the record pointer back up to the first record, so I'm going to call next in the else block. Otherwise, you'd have to click next twice to go from 1 to 2. And then finally, I'm going to fire a JOption pane and let them know why they can't decrease any further, why they can't click previous anymore, because they reached the very first record. Now that just leaves us 2 more buttons, first and last. And again, the code for them is very simple here. If you look at it, in this case, the code here, I'm just going to call the first method on my result set, result first. And I'm going to set the data in my fields just like this. That's for the first button. And then, of course, for the last button, I'm going to go call the last method. And I would just set the field data like this right here once I call the last method. So let's take a look at this, just very simple code, and see how our GUI works with our Access database and our JDBC ODBC bridge driver. So let's see how it works. We'll run it, and we'll check our navigation buttons. Alright, so I'm at record 1. I'm going to click next. I'm just going to keep going all the way to the end of the database, and there it says reach last record. Now I'm going to click previous, and now it's going backwards. Again, all the way to the very first record, and then it tells me I reached the first record. If I click last, it goes all the way to the last record. And if I click first, it goes all the way to the first record. Step 3. Now let's code the ability to change an existing record, that is, update it, delete a record, and add a new record. To do this, we will make use of the following methods. Update int, which updates an integer in a record field. Update double, which updates a double in a record field. Update string, which updates a string in a record field. Update row, which updates the entire row after updating the fields. Delete row, which deletes the currently selected row. Move to insert row, which moves the pointer to the end of the last record to prepare for insertion of a new record. And finally, insert row, which adds a new record. In this next version, we've added the ability to create new records, delete records, and update or change existing records. And to do this, first off, we had to add a few components to our GUI. So in this example, I simply added update, delete, new, and save JButtons. And when I did that, after I declared them, I had to add them, in this case to my JPanel BG, and then I had to add action listener to them so that I could then code if statements inside the action performed method. Okay, so that was all I really had to do to the GUI. So let me scroll down and we're going to look at action performed and see what's happening with our new JButtons. Alright, so these are the 4 new JButtons I added from the previous example: bUpdate, bDelete, bNew, and bSave. So let's go see what each of these do. When bUpdate is clicked, it triggers the method or calls the function bUpdate action here. And here's where I'm using update int, update string, and update double. And database fields are picky, so you have to be careful which one of these methods that you use, or you'll get SQL errors and all kinds of database errors. And if you're not sure, like in this example, I'm going to open up my Access database and look at it in design view. And if you look at it in design view, notice that ID here is a number, but it's a long integer. Notice that name is a string; it's just plain text. Notice quantity here is a number; it's a long integer. And if I go down to price here, currency, that's like a double. Okay, so it's important that I call the right method on my result set when I'm trying to modify or change or update the data. In other words, if I tried to use update string here, it would generate an error. Okay, and if I tried to use update int here, it would generate an error. So it's picky. You have to be careful. And I'm just using a little bit of nesting to cut down on lines of code. So in this case, I'm just getting the text from each of the fields. Notice I'm calling get text on each of the text fields, right? And then I'm nesting it where I have to parse it, so integer parse int or double parse double. I'm just converting the string data into the right data format depending on which update method I'm calling. Update double, update int, or update string. Well, when I'm done updating all of the fields from whatever text or data happens to be in those JText fields, I'm then going to go call the function or method update row, and that'll actually save all of the changes that I made to that record. Okay, I'm going to fire off the JAction pane and just say updated. So that's what update does. Now, if we come up here and look at action performed, oops, didn't mean to do that. Hit the mouse button. If I come up here and look at action performed here for delete, it goes and calls bDelete action, and all that's going to do is call the method delete row. Okay, and once I call it, trying to get it to highlight there, once I call the method delete row, I'm then going to call result previous, and that'll roll the pointer back to the record that was there previously, since I deleted the row there, and that way it'll set it up so that it's easy to navigate. So you'll want to do that when you call delete row. But so delete row is the sort of the new method that we're using here, and then again I just want to call display data. Remember what that does. When I call display data, it does the same thing it did in the last version of the program. This displays whatever that current record is in the result set. Okay, so that covers update, that covers delete, changing an existing record, deleting a record. Now what about creating a new record? That's where bNew and bSave come in. Okay, so let's scroll down and take a look at the code for those. All bNew does is clear the text, just double quotes, and it just clears the text in the text fields to prepare or to get everything ready for typing in a new record. So I type in the new record, and then I'm going to click save, and when I click save, I'm going to use two methods. I'm going to use move to insert row, or two new methods anyway. Move to insert row and that'll move the pointer down to the end of the last record. So it prepares it so that later on, when I call this function, insert row, it'll start it at the very end there. Okay? And then, of course, when I do that, I've got to call the right kind of update method, whether it's integer, string, or double. And when I get my text, I'm doing, again, nesting here. When I get my text from my text fields, remember I've got to parse them and convert them because it all comes in as string data. So if I'm calling update double, I have to nest it inside of double parse double and convert it. All right, if I'm calling update int, I have to nest it inside of integer parse int and convert it. Okay, I don't have to do anything here because that's update string, and anything from a text field comes in as string data anyway, but you get the idea. All right, so move to insert row, and then I update, calling the appropriate update method for the data type that each field is in my database. I then call insert row, and then once I do this, I'm going to close my statement. I'm going to go call select data. Now, do you remember what that does? I'll scroll up, and it hasn't changed any, but I'll show you what that does. Select data here. Oops, actually I did change it. Okay, well it's a good thing I'm going over it then, huh? In this case, my global statement object, I'm creating a statement, and again, type scroll insensitive, so I can click, the previous button and use the previous method. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to use that. And then result set concur updatable. This is not read only. I want to make sure this is updatable. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to commit changes to it via update or to add new records or delete records from it. But after that, this is the same. This is the same, SQL command, select asterisk, which is the wildcard everything from the table inventory. And then I go call the execute query method and pass in the SQL command. So way back down to the bottom again. All right, so I close the statement, and then when I call select data, that creates a new statement, right? Calls create statement again, and sets up my new result set, my record set. And then I'm simply going to go call result.last and move it to the end here, and then display data. Remember that it just displays the field data in the database, and I'll fire off a JAption pane saying updated. All right, so several changes there, and hopefully I didn't take too long to explain that, and also hopefully I didn't go too quickly, trying to get it just right there. But let's run it and see what it looks like, and I think that helps sometimes when you can see the program in action and you can look at the code. Okay, so next and previous work just like they did before. Last and first, no changes there. Here are the new buttons and the new methods and the new functions that we want to test out. So I'm going to go to the very last record, and I'm going to call delete. We'll test the delete method first. Well, when I do that, okay, it backs me up to 11 because I deleted 12. And if I go next, notice that now I'm at the end of the database. Okay. All right, so delete works the way that it should. Now, what about, in this case, an update if I change something? So here on my 11th record, and let's say that the price of these goes down to 80. Don't you wish you could get a 2 terabyte drive for 80 bucks? I bet if you looked around for one you could. 80 or 9, I'll make that a 0 right there. All right, so the price goes down. I'm going to go ahead and click update, and it says updated. And just to verify it, I'm going to go previous to 10 and 9, and then next to 11. And notice my new price is retained in the database. There's 80. Okay, so that tests update, that tests delete. Now let's test new. Remember I click new, that just clears all the text in the text fields. And I'm going to do 12 as my record item. And let's see, what is this going to be? Water cooling kit or something. Quantity 5. How much is it going to be? 55. Alright, so all my data is in there, and when I'm done, I'm going to click Save. Alright, and that just moves the result set, the record set, to the very end there, and previous 11, next 12. Okay, so you can see how that works, and you can see the code that we added to add that functionality to the graphical user interface for our database. Step 4. Adding search capability to our database. To do this, we will use execute query to execute a SQL command based on criteria entered by the user, SQL to compose a query based upon a search string, JRadio buttons to choose which field to perform the search on, and absolute to navigate to a specified record. The only thing we've done differently here is we've added search capability to our database. Other than that, all of the code is the same as it was in the previous examples. So I'm just going to go over the new code here. And in this example, we needed to add a JText field, which will give the user a place where they can type in a search string where they're going to look through the fields of the database to try to find something. And then I added a J button, in this case B search, and they'll click on that when they're done typing in the string they want to search for, and that'll start the search process. I had to add a button group and 4 radio buttons to give the user a way of clicking on the radio button and deciding which field to search on. ID, name, quantity, or price. And I guess there's a million ways that you could code that, but this will just give them the ability to select a certain field to search on before they click the search button. Okay, so those are our globals. They've been declared and instantiated with the new keyword. Now we have to add them into our interface. So here's my new text field, here's my new J button, and here's my 4 radio buttons being added there. Now I only have to add action listener to my J search button. My J button that's a search button. I don't have to add it to all my radio buttons because I'm not going to trigger an event when I click them. I'm just going to, when I click the search button, I'm just going to go look and see which one of those radio buttons I've selected or checked. And that's how I'm going to decide what field to search in with the search string. So I only have to add it just to the search button. So that's all set up, and of course an action performed. We had to then code an event handler and an if statement for the search button. And now let's go to the very bottom, and this is pretty much, the only other new code here. We have to handle that event. So what happens when they click on search? Well, I'm going to get the text, whatever it was they typed in that JText field. And of course anything with our result set, and JDBC needs to be inside try and catch blocks. So this whole block of code, notice it's in try and catch blocks as I scroll up and down. Okay, I'm going to, in this case, close the current statement, and I'm going to build a new statement. And the reason is because this time my string is going to be different. Remember before, my default SQL statement was select everything from inventory, and that just built up a record set, or excuse me, a result set with all of those records, all of those rows in the table. Well, here I'm starting a SQL string, select all from inventory where, specifying some criteria, and then it's unfinished. And then I want to come down here and I have 4 ifs based on which radio button is checked. And they're in a button group, so remember when you put radio buttons in a button group, only one can be checked at a time. And that's a good thing, because otherwise I would have problems. So only one being selected at a time. It's either ID, name, quantity, or price. And if they're selected, we're going to finish our SQL string. We're just going to accumulate or concatenate things together here and kind of cinch it up, such that select all from inventory where ID is equal to the search string, name is like the search string, and I added these percent symbols here so that, in other words, if I didn't add that, then it would have to be an exact match. In other words, if I were looking for AMD CPUs, I'd have to type in AMD CPUs. But by adding the percent symbols on both sides of the single quote in SQL, I'm saying, it's basically like using the contains method in Java. I'm saying, okay, whether or not it contains AMD, if it just has CPU in it, then yes, that would be a find. Okay, return that item, select that item. So in this case, ID equals where name like, and it's just a relative match there because of the percent symbols. Quantity equals or price equals. So you can see how that works with the radio buttons, and then that would complete the SQL string. And once it's complete and we've figured out what they're searching for and what field they want to search in, then we can take our SQL as a command and pass it in as a parameter argument to execute query on our statement object. And of course, the return result is going to be stored inside of result, our instance of result set. Now, that's all set there. So depending on whether or not it actually found anything that matched that SQL string, I'm going to come down here and I have an integer called test, and it'll start out at 0. And I have 2 strings, store and response. Okay, so test starts out at 0. I'm going to say while result next. Well, that's only going to happen if it finds the SQL string. Okay, if not, this entire while true loop possibly could be skipped if it doesn't find the string. And if that's the case, test would still be 0. It would not have changed. So notice that this code will only happen if test is not 0, if it did find something. Otherwise, it's going to say, hey, could not find that, and just fire off that J option pane. That's assuming that, I'm looking for something that wasn't there, rainbow, supercalifragilistic, whatever. Now, on the other hand, if it was there, it's going to increment test, so test will no longer be 0. So therefore, this if is going to happen instead of that else, okay, no longer 0. And then we're going to take the string here, and we're going to accumulate and concatenate and build things up. So I'm going to add a line for every record that I find. Each separate record will be on a separate line. So there's the escape sequence. I'm going to add a number, test, and then a decimal, period, to number it. And then I'm going to basically display the ID, the name, the quantity, and the price. So if there were 4 records that matched what I was searching for, then all 4 records would be built up inside the string here, the store string. Okay? And finally, when we're done and we break out of the while true loop, in this case, test would no longer be 0. So yes, we did find 1 or more records that match that criteria. Well, I'm going to use the absolute method to display the very last record. If I found 5 of them, I'll display 5 at the bottom. If I only found 1, I'm going to display that 1. But either way, I'm calling the absolute method and passing in the value of test to display that record, okay, that row, that record. And then I call the display data method, which will then turn around and update the fields, and the fields will become visible. And then finally here's my other string. Remember, 2 strings up here, there's response. Response is going to say number of records to match, and then test would have been incremented for however many records got found. Let's say that I typed in something and there were 3 records that match that criteria, that string. So it would say that number of records that match are 3, and then it would list it. I'm concatenating it to store, which was built up here, so it would list it in my JAption pane 1, 2, 3, going all the way down. So anyway, when I'm done with all of that, massaging and concatenating and accumulating strings and things, I'm going to take the end result of my string and I'm going to pass it into my JAption pane show message dialog, just to show all the records that I found. Okay. Either way, when I'm all done, I'm going to go call my old select data method, which will just that plain vanilla SQL string select everything from inventory, from the table. Not based on any search criteria, but just selecting all the records. So I'm going to build up a new result set. And then when I do that, I'm going to go to the first record and call display data to move it to the first record. Okay? So hopefully I explained that briefly and yet thoroughly, if that's possible to do both at the same time. So let's run it and see what it looks like. And again, a lot of times, you don't necessarily follow code until you actually see it in action and you run it. So everything else is there and works the same as it did before, but notice here are my JRadio buttons, and here's my search button, here's my JText field. Okay, so name is selected by default. I said set selected and name, that's my default. So let's say I'm going to look for CPU. Alright, that'll be my search string. I'm going to click search. Alright, so it found 3 records or 3 matches, 1, 2, 3. And these are the key values, right? That's the ID 2, 7, and 8. Quad-core AMD, quad-core Intel i7, and dual-core i7. And then, of course, the quantity and price there. And notice it moved the record set over here, in this case, to the last record. See, there's 3, which is ID 8, CPU, dual-core i7. So it moved the record to 8 there. And then when I click OK, it goes back to the first record. Okay. Let's say I wanted to find an ID. Well, I'll look for 8, because that was returned in the last search. Okay, so on ID, I'll click search. And just 1 record, because that's my primary key. So there's never going to be any 2 records that have the same ID value. That has to be unique, being the primary key. And there it is. Remember in the last search we did, that was at the bottom, number 3, but that's my dual core i7 with the ID of 8. Okay. Looking at price or quantity, I don't know, let's look for something that has a quantity of 50. Alright, there's something with a quantity of 50. And let's look at price. We'll look at something that has a price of 80. Alright, and then there's our hard drive, 11. So, very simple graphical interface with buttons and some simple JDBC code to show you how to code a GUI for your database, navigation buttons, and a search feature in your database.